Good morning, everyone. Welcome to another issue of Java with Otava. Appreciate you taking the time out of your schedules to join us. We are going to be talking today about zero trust. And I am really hoping that this is something that you guys have heard about, you have some background in, but if not, never fear, we have a group of panelists joining us today that are going to help walk us through really the use case here, the need, the driver, and some of the benefits that our organizations can reap through implementing a zero trust and similar security strategy as we still manage through and are addressing remote and workforce mobility concerns in today's market. So let me take a few moments and introduce our panelists. Zoe, let's start with you. If you could just quickly introduce yourself and give us a little bit of background.
Yeah, absolutely. Hi, everyone. Thanks for joining today. My name is Zoe Lindsey. I'm a security strategist at Duo Security, now part of Cisco. In this role, I've gotten to work with hundreds of organizations in just about every industry out there at every stage of their zero trust journey, from just implementing multi-factor for the first time to trying to update an existing deployment so that they are more ready for this hybrid environment that we're going to be talking a lot about today. Very excited to be here and looking forward to the discussion.
All right, thank you, Zoe. Jason, good morning.
Thank you, Jeremy. Yes, excuse me, I'm Jason Pullman, Director of Solutions Architecture here at Otava. I've been with the company now for a little over 4 years. I have a strong background in operations as well as on the sales side. I've had the opportunity to work with hundreds of different customers in different verticals like Zoe, as well, delivering cloud solutions here with a flair for security. So we'll be talking a lot about that today and looking forward to the discussion.
Excellent, excellent. Brandon, thank you for joining us again.
Yeah, thanks for having me. So Brandon McCoy, Senior System Engineer at Veeam. I've been with Veeam Software for about 3 years. I focus solely on our Veeam Cloud Service Provider program and helping managed service architect solutions for cloud backup, disaster recovery.
All right, and last but not least, myself, Jeremy Bigler. I am the Director of Product Management here at Otava and work with organizations such as Duo and Veeam and others to bring complete security-driven solutions to both our industry and our partner marketplace. So with that, let's jump in. As we've talked about in other Java with Otava videos, right? We've seen a rapid and very aggressive shift, right, towards remote workforce mobility, the concept of decentralizing our employee and our partner bases as a result of not only the pandemic, but I think what we are now starting to realize may be the next sort of new normal, if I can use that overused term, coming out of the COVID-19 issue, right? We have a lot of different challenges here. We've got users coming in now on a variety of devices, not only corporate owned or corporate sponsored, but bring your own device, bring your own access tool. Bring your own connectivity or connection. And we have a disparity around organizations who historically may have operated more in a 4 brick and mortar wall mentality with a closed perimeter, closed bastion, if you will, to really something that is far more porous than it ever was. And this presents challenges for us, right? Our perimeter now no longer exists at our 4 brick and mortar walls. It exists wherever our workers may happen to be. Zoe, from your experience working with Duo and Cisco, how have you seen sort of the pandemic and this issue impacting the remote or mobile use scenario?
Well, I don't think that it's a surprise that it's upended a lot of priorities and projects for folks. Fortunately, in the last 7 or 8 years, there's been this encouraging shift where a lot of times multi-factor conversations started purely as a response to pain, a response to compliance needs, whether that was an audit upcoming or one that they failed. And it was a rare occurrence that we talked to somebody that was doing multi-factor just as a best practice. We've seen a lot of growth in compliance demands for multi-factor, and we've seen a lot of growth in the adoption of multi-factor, but there's been an order of magnitude change just in the last several months. Because when there's not a huge amount that you can do to completely uproot your remote access infrastructure, multi-factor is one thing, especially if you're using a hybrid or a cloud-based solution that you can implement and deploy pretty rapidly. So that's definitely been a huge increase in conversations for us, as well as an expansion in customers that were already using it in a limited capacity, maybe for admin access, now opening it up for all their employees so they can still get their work done.
You know, it's interesting, Zoe, you mentioned multi-factor in that conversation. One of the things that we've heard or seen, even as evidenced in our past Java with Otava series around just ransomware and other security breaches facing organizations today, is the concept of a rise in social engineering as an attack vector. Have we seen that sort of trend around entities trying to hijack or appropriate user identifications and use that now as a new attack vector for a distributed model?
Absolutely. Social engineering attacks are sort of a perennial fave because they continue to work. There's not automatic patches that we can release for them. I think the only reason that it took second place to hacking in this past year's Verizon data breach report is just because of there are so many massive password dumps now out there that weak or stolen credentials are easier than ever to capture. But it's just part of this title shift that goes along with why we need to have the zero trust conversation. These attacks used to be network focused and systems focused because they needed to get that foothold inside that hardened perimeter and then try and pivot to where they were aiming. Now, increasingly, they're just going straight for identity and straight for data, whether that's capturing unsecured or improperly secured data, or holding data hostage that hasn't been properly backed up, or whether that is compromising the user through weak or stolen credentials that don't have strong authentication attached.
Makes sense. Makes sense. Brandon, I'm curious, what has Veeam seen out there from these sort of new threat landscape, perhaps?
Yeah, so a lot of service providers are definitely shifting. When you think about disaster recovery before all this, we think about natural disasters and power outages, and now that people are kind of stuck in their homes, there's a lot of myself included, our laptops are at home. We have these personal devices on our networks. So big switch to the agents, the endpoints, making sure machines are protected, and having some single pane of glass and visibility are some big things that we see out there.
Got it. And it ties, interestingly enough, into a study that was recently done. Around 1,004 CXOs were surveyed as a result of security challenges that the pandemic has introduced. 93% of which said that they had to actually cancel or postpone certain security priorities to deal with the rapid shift, the rapid enablement of remote workforce. And 85%, as we see here, said that they've also seen, which is a scary parallel, an increase in cyber attacks since the start of the pandemic. So what we've really seen, I think, is a organizational population that may be less secure today than they were prior to the pandemic, and an increase in arguably the least controllable portion, or the least controlled portion of the threat horizon, which is cyber. And incidentally enough, social engineering is also part of that because we're going after identities. I'm curious, panelists, weigh in on that. What do we see from your point of view here, and is this study aligned with what you've observed in the industry and talking to clients and partners?
Yeah, I'll take some of this real quick. Yeah, the patch management is what caught my eye when I first saw this report, and that's where a lot of people forget that, as Brandon just said, with the network that on the home LAN that you have, and all the different devices we have connected today, and then we're connecting into another network, is really understanding, doing posture checking on how we're connecting into that network. A lot of people are forgotten. Yeah, we'll get them in VPN because everybody had to shift that remote workforce almost immediately, almost overnight, it seemed like. And so they were more worried about getting people connected and less worried about posture checking. And now we're seeing that people are implementing those posture checks, making sure that patches are up to date, making sure that all the virus deaths are accurate. So really what jumps out at me at this is the 88%. And I know a lot of companies, and we're helping a lot of them right now deal with how to do that posture checking, make sure they are secure in the remote efforts and connecting remotely.
Yeah, and I'll jump in there too. You know, the VPN is probably the first thing that jumps out to me. Like I mentioned with everybody at home. So, you know, before when you could bring your laptop to the office, you were on that network. So backing up to, you know, your local admin was easy because you were already on the network. All you had to do was, you know, point to that repository. Now we're working from home, and it's like, how do we get our backups somewhere else? And you know, I think that's a great play for Otava and, you know, service providers and Veeam, being able to offer some of those technologies that we'll probably talk about later on, you know, kind of eliminating the complexity of VPNs and networking when we're all scattered across, you know, the globe.
And I'll just echo what Jason said on patch management. If we look at those social engineering attacks, the vast majority of them are phishing, and the vast majority of those phishing attacks are either going after credentials or access to a device to exploit it. And most of that can be fixed just by keeping patches up to date, because I think it was Gartner said 99% of vulnerabilities are already known to IT. Attackers aren't going out there and blowing ODAs at mass scale. It's not economical. They're doing affordable attacks, and those are the ones that have patches available. It's just users usually don't have them installed.
That's a good segue, Zoe, actually into the concept really of identity protection, right? And I think that is one of the last final bastions, right? As we know, we, the human element of IT, tends to be the weakest link because we can't patch ourselves, we can't firewall ourselves, we can't control human behavior, right? You can't stop somebody from clicking on a link, you can't stop somebody from answering a call from their IT group that asks them for their credentials, etc. But in addition to common best practices like consistent, continued security training, documented policies, you know, 0-day notification of suspected phishing, suspected attempts. I know MFA is also a key value here, right? We see this today in a lot of our remote banking applications. We see it today in a lot of our other transactional environments. Help us understand a little bit, though, and Zoe, I'll start with you, really around a construct for multi-factor within today's organization.
Absolutely. So I'm guessing that most folks on the call are familiar with the basics of MFA, so I'll try and keep this exceedingly brief. We know that passwords by themselves are not enough. We've seen significant movement on our understanding of the effectiveness of passwords in the last several years. I think in 2017, we saw a big update from NIST in their recommendations that took us away from that extremely long, extremely complex and random, multiple upper, lowercase, special characters, to move towards something that would be human memorable and focusing on the fact that we need to have unique passwords. It quickly becomes a process that is not intuitive or user-friendly. And what we know from user behavior is that if it isn't intuitive or user-friendly, users are going to find the easiest, least path of resistance, which usually means that it's less secure. They're doing Hunter 1, Hunter 2, Hunter 3 as their passwords. So passwords just aren't enough. And that's why strong authentication comes into play, primarily through multi-factor. And so you're pairing something you know, your username and password, with something you are, which could be a biometric method, or something that you have, which can be anything from a token to a phone in your possession to a unique device-based certificate. I want to mention here that when we're talking about MFA, not all methods are necessarily created equal. I think we've got a stat on the next page to talk about that. But what's important to keep in mind is that you want to make sure you have 2 or more of these methods. If we understand that username and password is something that we know, we can strike that off the list of options for our second factor. So we really want to avoid going to something else they know, like a knowledge question, and go to something that they are, something they have. As we start talking about this hybrid environment, where not only do you have resources inside your perimeter, but increasingly you've got cloud hosted resources that users may be able to reach directly by a URL and log into. It is even more important to make sure that you have these strong authentication measures in place.
Thank you, and that's one of the interesting things here, right? Is and you mentioned NIST as an example, Zoe. We've seen the compliance landscape for some time now mandate identity control, right? And not very many of the compliance or legislative acts behind those compliance requirements are prescriptive. But Jason, I'm curious, could you walk us through maybe some of your experience with compliant posture and identity control?
Yeah, especially with PCI, which is probably the most stringent compliancy out there. If anybody knows the compliance of the 12 requirements, 7, 8, and 9 talks about access and access controls. This really plays into multi-factor, and inside of our facilities and inside Otava, logically and physically, we practice all of these different concepts. And with Duo being a partner, we use Duo for pretty much everything. I mean, it's very simple to use. This is your fob for most people. We do have customers that have no BYOD policies to where they do have the key fobs as well to use. So been in many different scenarios where not only just for PCI, Jeremy, nowadays, but it's almost even outside of compliancy, it's an important practice of your security protocols to have multi-factor.
Now, you had mentioned something there, Jason, around bring your own device, right? And I think that is another area that we have significant exposure here, in that organizations are now facing users using uncontrolled, unmandated, unmanaged devices, right? I'm at home, and I'll speak for myself personally. I've got a handful of laptops and desktops that I can access at any one point in time. And I want an equivalent experience on any of those devices, right? I think that's the logical assumption that many of our employees have. So from a device trustworthiness, we've talked about this a little bit. Let's dive into that a little bit more in detail here. So Zoe, why don't you sort of lead us through here a little bit and talk about how we can ensure that devices we're allowing into our environment are appropriate, are healthy, and should be granted access.
Absolutely. So if we go back to those, I love the Verizon data breach report. It's one of the main resources that I like to go to for kind of the state of things. I appreciate that they really break down their methodology well. And if you look back over, the last at least 5 years of that report, you'll see that 2 of the most common factors in successful breaches are compromised or stolen user credentials. And then the next one right behind it is exploited or compromised devices. So we want to make sure that we are able to assess the patch level and assess the security hygiene of that device. MDM gets us part of the way there. MDM does a lot of things that we need to have for the managed devices in our environment to be able to wipe them, provision and deprovision, all of the sideload applications, all of those sort of direct admin level tasks. But where MDM can handicap us somewhat is if you have areas of your environment, user-owned devices that have access to company resources that don't have the MDM agent installed. We worked with a customer healthcare system. They have to meet HIPAA compliance requirement for making sure that all devices that are lost have been secured. We found that they had almost as many devices, another 30,000, that were not being captured by MDM because they weren't going to any resources that were protected by the firewall rules on the perimeter, but they were accessing some of those directly web-facing resources. So what we want to do is we want to make sure to have universal visibility as much as possible. And Duo we think the way to do this is right at the point of access, just by using the telemetry that's already there, either by having an app on a mobile device or through the user agent in the browser, or even like a user installable app for a laptop or desktop. This gives us some of these really important kind of hygiene metrics. Whether or not a lock screen is enabled on a device and whether or not that's protected with a biometric, that tells us how secure that device will be if it's left behind somewhere. Whether it's been rooted or jailbroken, if it's encrypted at rest, what OS and version it is, if it's running an up-to-date or an end-of-life version, as well as who owns that device, whether it's corporate managed or user-owned. Laptop and desktop side, a lot of the same things. OS inversion, here you can look into browser inversion shared through that user agent. We can also look at the stat of kind of those higher risk plugins like Flash and Java. And since, it's not just a matter of integrity and confidentiality that we want to make sure that we're checking into, but also availability, we want to make sure that we are accounting for the backup and the data protection status on those devices as well.
And that's another interesting point here. I think we've heard in the past, right? It's not a question of if, many times in the case of exploits or breaches or attacks, but more often a question of when. And Brandon, I'm curious, help us understand a little bit, right? We have a proliferation of remote workers, right? And as much as I think we'd all like to believe that our data is consolidated and safe and secure in a data center or a SaaS application database or similar, there's proliferation of unstructured data, I think, all throughout these environments. How can we improve or establish a good protection schema for those devices, even ones that are not controlled by the organization, in addition to what we may have today in the data centers or for SaaS applications?
Yeah, well, in terms of remote workers, I mean, the Veeam agent is what comes up automatically. Even for my computer, I recently had to get a new laptop because my old one wasn't working, and our IT administrator sent me a new one, and all of my, excuse me, all of my chat history and things like that were still there, but none of my data was. And so, I was responsible for backing that up. Just threw a Veeam agent on there and was able to back everything up quickly, as well as have the bare metal image. So in case, the whole machine were to go down, if you need just like a blank box. But, if that data had been compromised before the IT staff had copied everything over, I would have been out of luck. So having that offsite copy, the 3-2-1 rule, which we'll probably dive deeper into, but having, multiple copies of your data and having one of those data on another media offsite, I think is really important, whether it's, on-prem or off-prem in both scenarios.
Thank you. No, I appreciate that insight. And really, when we think about endpoints, right? Endpoints are a little bit of a concern for us, right? We talked a little bit about the proliferation of social attacks, of similar phishing, anything that's designed to get access to user information, right? But endpoints, right, in this particular case, right, seem to be our biggest exposure point, at least in the study here, according to the Verizon data breach report, that we have in today's threat landscape, right? 70% of breaches are occurring at the endpoint, at the end user device, right? And we see this trend either growing or at least sustaining as organizations remain mobile or distributed post-pandemic. So this is not, I want to be clear for those of us on the phone, this is not just a today thing until something changes pandemic-wise. This is likely a sustainable strategy and a sustainable trend moving forward. So we think about tying up endpoints here. I think this gives good discussion to the concept of really zero trust. So let's move on to that discussion. Zero trust. I know this is something that Cisco has a lot of thought leadership behind. So could you sort of take us through the basic tenets here of zero trust?
Absolutely. And I want to say the reason that, I think that you see 77% and 70%, those large statistics can be scary. I like to look at them more as encouraging because it tells us where we can really focus first, kind of the big rocks that we want to solve for, so that we can solve those less common edge cases, but cover the most with the least amount of effort. And I think sometimes zero trust gets talked about as though it is a product in and of itself, or as though it's a silver bullet for all of the ills in your environment. And I don't think that's the case. I think if somebody says that to you, you should run the other direction as fast as you can. We have the environment that we have, right? And so when we're talking about any sort of change in our strategy, we need to think about that in logical increments and how we grow it throughout the business. So we have really looked at, in Duo's perspective, where we are focused on secure access. We have started a 5-step maturity model. So it starts, baseline, is validating the identity of all users with strong multi-factor authentication. 77% is weak or stolen user credentials. Multi-factor greatly reduces the risk posed by those credentials if captured. If you do nothing else, start there. After that, if we look at security at its most basic, we need to have visibility on what's going on, and we need to be able to exert influence or make access decisions based on what's going on. That starts with visibility. So we need to evaluate the trustworthiness of devices. With Duo, we do this right at the point of access. As a user is prompted for multi-factor, we're doing an on-the-spot check that when that access decision is being made. I want to emphasize zero trust does not mean don't trust your users. It means don't allow your users to inherit trust based solely on a network, which has been a big part of our previous strategy. Once you have that visibility, now you can actually start to have influence. So now you can start to define policies. And if we want to have effective policies rather than just a single one-size-fits-all, we want to find the right balance of security and convenience based on not only our global security posture, but the sensitivity of that application and the level of permissions that a given user group has with that application. After you do that, as you go through this process, you're going to be building up a library of resources to help you as you add other use cases. So as users get enrolled, you're building an inventory of users and devices that are associated. As you build out these applications, you're going to begin to build a policy library that as you create new applications can just quickly be attached to. So now we're really in a good position to start expanding this process. Most people start with their existing remote access program, VPN or RDP, but then you can expand it out because if you're protecting a user, you should really protect them everywhere that sensitive data is stored. And that will become progressively easier as you build out that solution. I'll pass it back to talk a little bit more in depth about protecting data because that is less in Duo's flow, but still a key part of this Zero Trust Data Access program.
Yeah, so Brandon, if you could jump in here, tell us a little bit really around this. I know 321, but now I think we've expanded it to be 32110 in a truly secure model. Help us understand what that means.
Sure, absolutely. So the 3-2-1 rule was one of the first things I ever heard about when I started at Veeam. I thought we created it, and then I learned that we didn't, but we're definitely big proponents of it. So basically you have 3 copies of your data. That's your production data, and then the first backup of that data, and then an additional backup copy of that data. But that's not good enough because if all of that data is in one location and, for instance, in this pandemic, you can't get into your data center if a machine goes down or the whole data center is wiped out. So you have, 2 different media types, which is the 2, and one of those media types is offsite. So 3 copies of your data on 2 devices, 1 offsite, maybe even 1 offline. So that's the other 1. That could be, a tape device or some kind of immutable backup that's just not connected to the internet at all. And that should lead to 0 errors. So that's the 0 there.
Perfect. Makes sense. Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And then, Zoe, I think back to you for anomalous behavior. Right? I think that's been evaluated in the Cisco Defense in Depth for quite some time now, but help shed some light on that if you would.
Absolutely. So I think that the problem for most organizations these days is not being able to get any level of visibility. It's rather being able to filter the signal from all of the noise. I talk a lot with folks in higher education, and just one example from there, they talk about how they have students that traditionally had a single device, their laptop or desktop, that now can have 12 or more between smart bulbs, Nest, the game consoles, mobile devices, so on and so forth. So it becomes really important once these key pieces are in place to get smarter, work smarter and not harder, and really focus on those anomalous incidents that are more likely to be an actual threat. As you continue to build up this inventory of users and devices and policies, you're also building a history. And from that history, you can start to track trends. And from those trends, you can quickly identify anomalous interactions that will really help your admins kind of clear the clutter and focus on what may actually pose a risk.
So, Zoe, one question I think that may arise looking at this, right, is I think these are all probably fairly logical, straightforward elements here, but how does this translate really into an actionable strategy for an organization? How do they actually go through and structure a prescriptive program or process to address sort of a zero trust posture here? Could you help us shed some light there or walk us through that, what organizations could do to implement that?
Absolutely. So I think that there's definitely not a one size fits all, but what I recommend for every organization is to start with a big room, not just your security analysts, but those that are responsible for managing major technology throughout the organization. Have a representative there from your sales operations team, from your DevOps team, and enumerate what those key priorities are, what qualifies as your crown jewels, and what traditionally has posed a problem for you. Have you seen a higher than usual number of ransomware attacks? Just in the last several months, there's been a massive increase, for example, in ransomware targeting manufacturing. So you may want to prioritize device posture assessment a little bit higher, or prioritize making sure that you've got your 32110 in place a little higher if that's the primary threat that you're facing. From there, I think, I'm a big fan of the old getting things done philosophy. You can't just think of your zero trust migration as a project. You need to break it down into those actionable steps. I recommend starting with where you have already defined zero access. Remote access, because that's going to be the easiest to kind of migrate over, and expanding out from there. But I also like looking at references, what other folks have done. I highly recommend checking out the white papers that Google has released about their Beyond Corp transition that started in 2014. Google's obviously enormous enterprise that had a lot of opportunity to refine their rollout process and integration process as they moved throughout the business. And just a little plug for Duo, we also have a couple of evaluation guides that walk you through questionnaires to help you define those key use cases as well. And that's a free resource.
Jeremy, I'd like to comment as well on this one. What we're seeing out there in the field is that, especially with 3, 4, and 6 here, is really understanding that data that's coming in from your access policies, especially from the VPN concentration checkpoint. Just don't have those access policies out there, but make sure you understand and review those logs. Almost every concentrator out there will have the ability to download those logs. Make sure you're taking those logs and put them in a log analyzer to understand what's going on, trending analysis, like Zoe said, to make sure you understand your risk profiles, because there might be something brewing there you don't see just yet, and that's an easy one to implement. And just reviewing those logs, a lot of people overlook that there's capture that data. There's a lot of golden information in that data.
That's good information. Thank you, Jason. And that is critical, right? I think that starts to identify, some of that anomalous behavior. If you start to see access requests coming in from a strange, geo-based IP range, 10 to 1, you could have a phishing or an identity hijack issue, correct?
Right.
So this, I think, is good conversation. Let's talk a little bit about where zero trust is in the organizational landscape, right? And there's a lot of discussion around it. I think zero trust is something that a lot of people are speaking about, but I don't know if we've had yet a lot of full implementation of a zero trust holistic policy. For example, this is a research that was done a while ago. 50% of IT executives that were surveyed do in fact feel that zero trust is critical to organizational security, right? 2% deemed it non-essential. Only 2% deemed it non-essential for enterprise organizations. However, if we look at what zero trust components are in place today, I think we see really a preponderance around both single sign-on and multi-factor, which is certainly key formative pieces, but not necessarily the total picture. In fact, Illumo, who conducted the survey, looking forward into 21 and beyond, found that 59% of respondents feel that their endpoint security policies today will miss between 1 to 10% of potential attacks or potential penetrations. So that's a pretty scary number. In fact, brief plug for our one of our past Java with Otavas, where we had some compliance attorney thought leadership on around the cost and the impact of security breaches from a compliance or from a litigation legislation impact perspective. That's a pretty big threat risk that organizations today are facing. Moving forward, right, the next bastion here appears to be microsegmentation. 51% of respondents stated that they are going to address microsegmentation as their primary zero trust control. And that's likely, Jason, I'm curious as to your thoughts here, but that's likely given the 90+% of traffic in the data centers being east-west and no longer north-south in and out of a traditional perimeter. As well as software-defined perimeter being another piece of that, moving away from the holistic brick and mortar sort of closed wall perspective. But Jason, I'm curious, what are some of your thoughts here around really where we see security heading?
If you look at this graph, I find it interesting. 75% see as important. I think we all do, if we're asking the right questions. I also think if you look down the list here, some of the things that we're going to implement here is it's not just one thing that's going to be the silver bullet that's going to make sure your organization is protected. It is a practice. It's a practice with multiple components. Microsegmentation for east-west is really important, but if you don't have multi-factor authentication coming into that, you're allowing the free access coming in and out from maybe untrusted networks, that's still going to cause issues. So make sure it's a practice all the way through, not just one or two of these items here. Make sure it encompasses the entire stack for access. But yes, like you said, microsegmentation with 90% of the traffic going east and west, that there is a greater concern on how can I segment this, or how can I isolate my exposure here or my risk profile? What's the best way to do that? And so we're seeing really an increase in asking us how we can microsegment and any information we have around that to help not only east, west, but north and south. Because really, like I mentioned before, with the multi-factor coming in and a multi-practice program here, north and south is equally important as east and west.
Got it. Thank you. Now, one thing I do want to talk about, right? This is all online accessible information, right? This is all live information that our employees, our organizations have access to. But Brandon, you had mentioned a little bit ago around the 32110 practice around having perhaps some offline protection for data. So I did want to go into that just a little bit here. So one of the things that I think is important, right, and we think about this from the standpoint of some of the more recent ransomware and similar attacks that I think do in fact target data productivity and other solutions that may be in place within an organization as really their first tier of breaking down a secure profile within an affected environment. Help us understand a little bit here, Jason, and also weigh in on where we see offline storage or mutable storage playing a role in good holistic security overview.
Yeah, sorry about that. I was on mute there. Yeah, and I'll let Jason take most of this, but what I see here are a variety of different ways other than just thinking your traditional backup. And having, the replicated virtual machines, and that talks to more than just backups, but it also talks to what we refer to as RTPO, so recovery time objectives, recovery point objectives. How much data can you afford to lose in between those windows where backups or replication is not happening, and how quickly do you need to be up and running again, to sustain your business? So I think those are real important things. And lastly, on the primary storage snapshots here as well, that's a huge thing that is sometimes mistaken as being a backup. I've got these storage snapshots. Real quick, I had a customer a long time ago who had a horror story of, they were running one of our features called instant VM recovery, and we would take a backup and we mount it to the repository, and instantly you're up. So it's great for real small recovery time objectives. The thing is he was doing this off of a storage snapshot, which we have these integrations with. The storage snapshot itself was scheduled to take a snap every hour, and after 24 hours, the oldest one would be deleted. Well, this customer ran their instant VM recovery, which is really just a temporary process, for longer than that. And so once it had gone 24 hours, that snapshot was removed from the production data store, and all of the information that was being saved and attached to that was no longer there. So that's a good reason to have a bunch of different varieties of backups and some of these other options that we see here.
Yeah, I agree with all of that. And when you look at all this is all important, and that's really why adherence to the 3-2-1-1-0 now is just equally important. So if we'll send out a link to the 3-2-1-1-0 means to everybody, just so you make sure you understand that concept. But having the tape, tape or even some sort of NAS device, to understand the durability cycles. A lot of people, we hear a lot of customers say, yeah, I got a tape from 10 years ago. And I start to say, okay, first thing, let's make sure that the tape's not melted or it's usable, whatever the case may be. Remember your durability cycles for anything offline as well, so don't get caught in that mess. The snapshots, a great tool to use to embellish your program here, especially if the RTOs are really steep and aggressive. It's a good thing to use, and keep in mind how long you need that. Think about your long weekends that you may have, 3-day weekends, 4-day weekends, whatever the holidays may fall, and make sure you're planning that accordingly to have full coverage of those long extended weekends. Having the offline repositories, when we talk about the 1-0, the 1 being offline, the 0 being 0 errors, a couple of things there is get that data off-site. Veeam has the Cloud Connect. We adopted it into our profile of our product set as well. Has a great opportunity to get the data off-site and then give you some separation with having ransomware protection, to where we keep offline copies of that data for you as part of the product set, which we'll talk about here in a minute. So very, very important there. And then, of course, depending on what's your RTO, RPO, replicated VMs, getting those offsite. You can get those offsite in various different ways. We have several different products that we can do to get that data offsite to help you, and then be able to have it offline to further protect your data. Also, one other thing a lot of people forget too, once we have this offline copies and they're keeping them for a long time, don't forget about versioning of your backup software, and be very careful. Probably every operational guy that's on this line here ran into this once or twice. Remember native copies when you're looking at long-term archive as well. So that's another suggestion, because we talked to a lot of customers that they have some data, but they have no way of getting that data off there. If it was in a native format, we can get it back recovered a lot quicker if that is the case.
Good insight there, and yeah, I can attest to being a victim of version control myself in past lives. So good insight there. Thank you. So, folks, one of the things that, or all of the things rather, we've been speaking about now, I think apply equally to premise and hosted environments, right? I do want to spend some time to talk a little bit about how Otava can help empower you from a security and a secure hosting and similar environment. I won't go into this in detail, but from a compliant hosting or heavy security-based hosting environment, if security is a concern, right? Location access or similar may be a concern with reduced staff or remote workforce now and during the pandemic, etc. There are some solutions that you can avail yourselves of using a secure hosted environment. But specifically, I think what I'd like, and Jason, if you could walk us through very quickly here, would be just some overview into some of the security add-ins or add-ons here that we cover that may help our organizations maintain a higher security hosted posture versus what may be traditionally done on-prem.
Sure. Yes. So add-ins, it's not just about providing maybe a hybrid cloud model. It's also layered services as well to make sure we're giving the overall package for that true experience that you might have on premise. So our layered services cover data protection. We've been over a little bit of that already. And I'll show you how all of these in just a second. I believe it's the next slide. It's not just saying that we have these services out here, but also there's a practice and how to apply them. And we're gonna use an anatomy of I believe it's a PCI stack is the next slide on how we apply this. So having data protection, of course, to recover. Talking about RTOs and RPOs to be able to recover to get the business back online. What are the business expectations? How does those expectations align with any BIAs that might have been done, and or what is the whole business continuity strategy, and how can we implement a good protection strategy to complement that business continuity strategy? Microsegmentation, we mentioned the importance of that, the growing importance of that. We've heard of this, now for what, I don't know, last 6-7 years or so, but really the adoption is there. It's starting to take place more and more. And people are understanding their risk profiles and the attack surfaces that are out there, especially with East-West. So microsegmentation has been coming up more and more, and our customers are asking about it. And we're solutioning more around microsegmentation. The managed security, these really align with a lot of the compliances that are out there. The daily log review, which is a requirement both for PCI and HIPAA. Having a WAF, a web application firewall, to protect from the upper level stack of the model from different attacks from that vector. Integrity scans, understanding what's happening to the files, especially for PCI. Understanding, who's accessing, if they're making any changes, any modifications, ones made, and having that data available to be able to record, report out, and find trends on. Vol scans, integrity scans, and then we get into some of the basics that everybody practices, right? The antivirus solutions. But having vol scans and then penetration testing. And one thing we do here, and you don't see penetration testing on here, the reason why we don't have it on here is because you want a third party to come in. If you have your data within our cloud or any cloud for that matter, and if they offer you pen testing, you might want to go outside. And if you guys want any references, we can certainly reference third parties that work very well in that scenario.
So Jason, you had mentioned a compliance stack, right? PCI being one of them, HIPAA, high-tech being another one, and similar. I think this sort of mirrors what we just discussed a little bit here, but really the concept, and take us into the areas here that you feel are the most cogent. But I think this mirrors the concept of really having a prescriptive security posture and strategy for hosted workloads that meet or exceed the current requirements from a legislation, from a security, from a best practices standpoint, and not treat security essentially as an afterthought. What would be your comments to the architecture in that approach?
Yeah, and I'm glad to see you use the PCI stack, because like I said before, it's really one of the most stringent that's out there. with the 12 requirements that are out there, and how we apply those 12 requirements to the stack from the outside in through edge, down through the compute, the storage, and then your data protection strategies. So as you can see here, several of these I've already mentioned though, but running vol scans, there's tools out there. So if you're thinking, okay, I don't have the money, the budget, the personnel to get out in the cloud right now, I need something today, there's vol scan tools out there that you can use locally on your network. And just get a red, green, yellow visibility report on where you're most vulnerable. The web application firewall, especially through SQL, a lot of database applications coming in, you really want to look at a web application firewall. A lot of people think the firewall will protect you. Well, it does at certain layers in the stack, but you really have to think from the application level of how you're going to protect that access as well, and that's where the WAF comes into play. And a lot of that is in I don't have a pointer. If I did, it's in that first box, so it's really at the edge there before you come in. And then the biggest one, like we've been talking about, as Zoe has been alluding to, about people going after credentials. Once you have those credentials, whatever they have access to is now in their hands. So having the two-factor coming in at multiple layers too. I mean, it's I think of the Frank's hot sauce commercial. Internally here at Otava, we use Duo for everything that we can. We have two-factor on. I mentioned the vol scannings. Of course, the SSL certs there in the first box. Then we get into the second box, which is more of a reactive scenario, but it's the log review. And not just on the servers. I mentioned before having the log review from any device that can report logs out. I mentioned the VPN concentrators. A lot of people forget about that. They just think it from a server standpoint. So don't forget about all your devices that users coming from the outside or maybe from an untrusted network pass through. Make sure you're grabbing logs from those devices. I mentioned the FIM, understanding access to the files. It comes in to even antivirus and data encryption, right? Data encryption in flight and at rest is very important for a lot of our compliances out there. And then having two different types of servers, separating the application from the web, the database to middleware, and making sure you have the appropriate logical segmentation with the application. And then we get into where our OCB Veeam back products come in with offsite backup and disaster recovery. So I mentioned earlier that security is not just one or two things, it's an entire practice. This is how we apply it to our PCI stack. And we have stacks for many different compliances here at Otava.
Thank you, and good segue there into some of the data protection. I won't go too deep into this. Just as a public service announcement, everybody on this call will receive a copy of these slides, so you'll have plenty of time to review these at your leisure. But I do want to cover quickly the concept of protection across really a few different endpoints, most importantly being SaaS platforms. Things like Office 365, which I'm sure probably everybody on this call uses in one form or another, and the need to make sure that that information is, of course, backed up, is, of course, recoverable and protected over and above what you may feel Microsoft is doing, but likely isn't. So if you haven't looked at the level of protection you're getting from Microsoft, take a moment, do so. You may be surprised, and obviously that may be a gap in your practice. But with that said, I'm not going to go through this. I do want to wrap on an offer for those of you joining us today, and that is we are offering gratis to anyone who wants to take advantage of this a no obligation remote workforce assessment. This assessment is really designed to help understand where you are today in your preparedness for remote working, where you may be exposed from a vulnerability or from a gap perspective, and then what processes or practices can you implement to close or fill those gaps. Again, no obligation, no fee. There is a website here that you can use, and again, these slides will be presented out to you. If that is something that you're interested in, take advantage of. Go there, fill that out, and Jason and his team will be the ones that that will be predominantly leading the process through, understanding where those where you are today, how you're positioned, where, if any, gaps exist, and then how you can best close or address those gaps. So with that said, everyone, thank you for your time. I know that there's a couple questions that have come in, so let me just take a brief moment. If you haven't already submitted any and do have questions, feel free to use the question comment feature within the meeting. But a few questions that come up. First and foremost, and Zoe, I'll let you start with this. Jason and Brandon jump in as well. There's some questions around mobile device management, right? Are there industry leaders or market leaders that we may think about or recommend as part of a zero trust solution?
Sorry, I had to unmute myself there. Well, I'm biased certainly, but I think between Meraki and AMP for endpoints, you're pretty well positioned. On the Duo side, if you're looking at us for the secure access piece of your strategy, there's some nice integrations to automatically add installed status for those to your policy. We do work with other MDM solutions as well. And I would also say, you know, depending on the size of your organization, you can take a look at the mobile device management tools for the platforms that are out there. If you're using, for example, if you're using Google Apps, you may be able to use at least some functionality of the Google Organization Manager, Google Admin Tool. I can't remember exactly what it's called. But yeah, I think Meraki's pretty good, but there's good solutions out there depending on the size of your budget and the scope of your deployment.
All right, thank you. And for those of you also out there that are VMware shops, I know that obviously, as you know, Otava is 100% VMware. The Workspace ONE and AirWatch platform also work very well with the Meraki suite and provide you some additional hypervisor-based security. And additionally, we did have one question around security frameworks coming in, right? We had mentioned NIST early on. I know of a few companies using the NIST security framework as well as some of the ISO requirements. First of all, I think from a general security practice, and Zoe, I'll go back to you again, maybe for Cisco's point of view on this. Do we see a predominant security framework emerging, or is it more based on the application or use of the organization in question? And secondarily, are there any high-level recommendations for how an organization could approach integrating a security framework into its operational structure?
Yeah, I think that the frameworks that are most directly driving change in the industry are either those that are regional or industry specific. I think that a lot of folks have made significant changes to their strategy and environment based on HIPAA and PCI. And I think that there's also been a massive shift to accommodate GDPR and California's version of GDPR. It's one of those things where it can be beneficial for an organization if you aren't able to get approval for budget for the projects that you need to keep your organization safe. Then compliance can be that stick that you can say, hey, if we don't do this, it's going to cost us money and it's going to cost us this much. But more than anything else, I think that, you know, if you look at the compliance standards out there, I do think that NIST is a really good one in terms of general recommendations, as well as both their general guidelines as well as some of the more specific ones, the 800 series and CMMC. Even if you're not in the federal space, these guidelines, these frameworks have had a lot of thought put into them. They have an eye towards future development, but also are hedging on the side of more conservative adoption of new technologies. And so especially, you know, if you're in a business that it's tough to be on the cutting edge it can be a great resource for you. I think if you use these compliance guidelines as a resource, you'll find that by the time you've implemented their best practices, odds are you're already at compliance for the standards that you need. So I really like to encourage that, think outside the checkbox kind of approach to compliance.
Excellent, excellent. Appreciate that. Folks, we are at the top of the hour. I want to thank you all for your time. Appreciate your attendance. Do take a moment if you have a few free cycles. Definitely check out the Java with Otava series on YouTube from Otava. There's a lot of interesting concepts out there. Most importantly, as we talk about security, certainly in today's discussion, several other relevant topics that may spike your interest there as well. And last but not least, look forward to seeing you on the 22nd of September. With that said, enjoy your day and have a great Labor Day holiday coming up.